The coffee walk. The finca was called El Silencio, a name it had carried for as long as anyone in the valley remembered. The name was painted on a weathered wooden board above the gate, the letters faded by the sun and the rain of many seasons. 3 generations of women had grown coffee on this steep slope of the western range of the Colombian Andes, and the name had remained unchanged through all of them. Valentina had been born on this farm and had learned to walk in the dirt between the coffee rows. She had learned the names of the trees, the birds, and the seasons by being among them, and now at 32 she ran the farm herself. Her mother had run it before her, and her grandmother before that, a line of women who had grown coffee on this slope for more than 70 years. They had developed an intimate knowledge of this piece of ground, its slopes and its soils, the way the light fell across it in each month of the year. The grandmother had bought the land in the early 1950s, when the valley was still reached by a track that became impassable in the wet season. The coffee was carried down to the road on the backs of mules in those days, the track too narrow for a vehicle. The grandmother cleared the first section herself, cutting the brush and the secondary forest with a machete, and planting the first coffee trees from bourbon seedlings. She carried them from a nursery in the town on the other side of the ridge in a basket on her back, walking the old trail that the indigenous people of the mountains had used to travel between the valleys. She was a young woman when she bought the land, not much older than Valentina was now, and she cleared it and planted it with her own hands. A neighbor came up from the valley to assist her in exchange for a share of the first harvest, and together they built the first shelter. The first harvest was small because the trees were young and not yet mature, but it was enough to keep the grandmother alive through that first year. It gave her the confidence that she had made the right decision. She planted the bourbon trees in rows that followed the contour of the land, the same layout that Valentina still used today. The grandmother understood something about the way water moved across a steep slope, the way the soil held together when the roots of the trees ran along the contour rather than up and down it. Her knowledge had come from watching, not from books, and she passed that knowledge to her daughter. Her daughter passed it to Valentina, and the knowledge shaped the landscape of this valley and of every coffee-growing valley in this part of the mountains. Valentina's mother was born on this farm too, the first of the grandmother's children to survive infancy. She grew up among the coffee rows and learned the work from her mother in the same way Valentina learned it from her. The mother expanded the farm, planting the second section with new varieties when the old bourbon began to decline, and she built the house that Valentina now lived in. She replaced the old wattle and daub structure with stone and concrete, adding a proper kitchen and a zinc roof that did not leak in the heavy rains of the wet season. Valentina grew up in this house as an only child, knowing from an early age that the farm would be hers one day. She did not question this, and she did not want any other life. When her father died of a sudden fever when she was 16, she left school and returned to the farm to work beside her mother. She never left again. Now her mother was 64 years old and lived in a small house at the edge of the village, a house with a garden and a view of the valley that Valentina visited every Sunday with the children. Her mother's hands no longer had the strength for the picking, the constant gripping and pulling of the cherries over the hours of the harvest. But she still came up to the finca during the busiest weeks to help with the sorting and the drying. Her eyes were still sharp enough to spot a defective cherry from across the patio, and her judgment of the fermentation was trusted more than anyone else's. The finca was divided into 3 sections. The upper section ran along the crest of the ridge and was the section the grandmother had planted first, the coffee bushes there growing in the thinnest soil but receiving the most sun. The middle section was the largest, planted by the mother in the 1980s with the Caturra variety that was then being promoted by the Colombian Coffee Growers Federation. The lower section was the one Valentina had planted herself, working alone through 2 dry seasons. She carried the seedlings from the nursery in the back of a neighbor's truck and planted them in holes she had dug in the preceding weeks. She chose the Castillo variety, a newer variety developed for resistance to the leaf rust that had devastated farms across the region. The 3 sections did not exhaust the land of the finca. There was a small plot of plantain that grew along the stream at the bottom, the plantain harvested twice a year and eaten on the farm or traded with neighbors. There was a grove of bamboo that the grandmother had planted along the western boundary, a windbreak that protected the coffee from the strong afternoon winds coming over the ridge from the Pacific side of the mountains. There was a garden beside the house where Valentina grew tomatoes, onions, peppers, and cilantro, the garden watered by hand from the stream in the dry season and growing on its own in the wet season. The finca covered 3 hectares in total, producing in a good year enough coffee to sustain the family and to sell at the market in the town below the ridge. There was enough surplus to pay for the children's school and for the occasional repairs that the house and processing equipment required. Valentina did not know the exact income of the farm from one year to the next because it varied too much. Some years the harvest was heavy and the price was good and she could save, and other years the harvest was small or the price was low and she drew from the savings of the good years. She did the work and she trusted that the work would provide. She woke in the dark, the room cool, the air coming through the open window from the east carrying the smell of damp earth and of the night's moisture on the leaves. Her alarm had not been set because it never was in the harvest season. She woke naturally before the light, her body knowing the time, her eyes opening in the darkness a few minutes before 5 o'clock in the morning. This happened the same way every day for the 2 months of the harvest. She lay for a moment without moving, her hands folded on the blanket. The house was quiet. From outside came the sound of the stream that ran along the lower boundary of the finca, a constant sound in her life, the sound of water moving over stone. When she was away from the farm, she missed this sound more than any other. A dog barked once from across the valley and was silent, and a bird called from the coffee trees below the house, the first call of the morning. The note was repeated 3 times, then repeated again, the call she thought of as the beginning of the day on this farm. She got up and dressed in the dark, knowing where everything was in the room and needing no light. The thick cotton shirt, the trousers with the reinforced knees, the rubber boots that had molded to the shape of her feet over 3 seasons of wear. She pulled her hair back and tied it. She had done this on the same morning in the same way for so many years that the actions required no thought, her hands moving through the series of movements on their own. The kitchen was at the back of the house, facing the uphill slopes, a large room with a wood stove and a table and chairs. She lit the stove and put water on to boil, and while the water heated she stood at the window and looked up at the hillside. The coffee trees were dark shapes against the slightly lighter dark of the sky, the silhouettes of the taller shade trees rising above them. She could not yet see the color of the cherries in this light, but she knew they were there. She had seen them yesterday in the afternoon sun, the red deep and even, the harvest coming into its fullness. She made coffee in the way she always made it, using ground coffee from the finca itself in a small cloth filter. The water poured slowly through the grounds. The smell filled the kitchen. She drank it black from a ceramic cup that had been her grandmother's. She used it only during the harvest. The cup was unremarkable except that it had been used at this table on this farm for the same purpose for a very long time. The same morning coffee, the same cup, the same quiet before the work began. Beyond the kitchen window, the dark was beginning to change. It was not yet light, but the darkness was less dense than it had been, the shapes of things acquiring definition. The ridge across the valley had begun to show its outline against the paling eastern sky, and she could see how the mist had settled in the valley bottom. It was a thick layer of white cloud that filled the valley floor and rose partway up the opposite slope, the tips of the tallest trees emerging from it like islands. This was her landscape, and she knew its every feature. The way the ridge curved to the east at the northern end of the valley. The shape of the gap where the road climbed up to the pass. The place on the opposite slope, where a stand of wax palms rose above the canopy, their tall slender trunks and dark crowns visible from every part of the finca. Their tall slender trunks and dark crowns were visible from every part of the finca. She had known this view from this window since she was a child, before she had known what a view was, before she had understood that the landscape might seem remarkable to someone who had not grown up in it. She finished her coffee and rinsed the cup, then put the cloth filter in a small bowl to be washed later. She took the straw hat from its hook beside the back door and stepped outside. The air was cold, as it always was at this hour at this altitude, the finca lying at 1,600 meters above the sea. The mornings were cool even in the dry season, the dew heavy on every surface, the grass at the edge of the path wet against the side of her boots. She breathed deeply, and the air felt clean and thin. She stood in the yard below the house, her basket on the ground beside her, looking at the hillside in the growing light. The basket was made of woven palm fiber, wide and shallow, with a strap for carrying it across her body so that her hands were free for picking. She had woven this basket herself, as every picker on the finca did, choosing the fibers and weaving them over the shape of her own body. It fitted her closely and comfortably, and a good basket made a real difference in the harvest. A basket that was the wrong shape or weight would become tiring over the hours of picking, but hers was exactly right. She had woven it 4 years ago, and it had held every harvest since then. The yard was on the flattest part of the farm, a narrow strip of level ground where the house and the drying patio and the processing area had been built. It was the only flat ground on the finca, because the whole farm was steep, the coffee planted in rows that followed the contour of the slope. The rows curved with the shape of the land, each row at a slightly different altitude from the row below it, the land falling away from the ridge crest down to the stream at the bottom. She slung the basket across her body and adjusted the strap until the basket sat against her right hip. She took the leaf blower and started it, the small engine coming to life with a steady drone, and walked to the drying patio. It was a concrete slab beside the house where the coffee cherries would be laid to dry after they had been pulped and washed. She swept the patio with the blower, clearing the fallen leaves and dust that had settled on it overnight, blowing the debris off the edge of the concrete. The patio had to be completely clean because any leaf or piece of bark or stone that fell among the drying cherries would introduce an earthiness that the coffee would carry through the cup. The light was beginning to come now, the sky above the eastern ridge turning from dark to pale, a strip of luminous gray spreading upward as the sun approached the horizon. The mist in the valley had begun to move, not dispersing yet, but shifting gently with the currents of air along the valley floor, a slow motion like water not quite still. To the south, the ridge was a solid dark shape against the pale sky, the line of it clean and continuous. She finished sweeping and put the leaf blower away, then stood in the center of the patio and looked at the hillside. The coffee trees were clearly visible in the half-light, the dark green foliage massed along the contours of the land, the rows running in parallel curves like the lines of a map. The red of the ripe cherries was scattered across the canopy like small bright points, the color of them vivid against the dark green. She stood looking at the hillside for a long moment, the way she did every morning of the harvest. The work was ahead of her, and the day was ahead of her, and the hillside was full of the fruit that she would take from it. The moment before the picking began was always the same, a brief pause in which she stood on the clean concrete of the patio and looked at what the farm had produced. Then she turned and began to climb. She climbed the path between the upper and middle sections, a path she knew in a way that was difficult to describe to someone who had not grown up on a farm like this. She knew which stones were loose and which were firm, where the water had worn the path down and where the debris of the dry season had built it up. She knew the soft places where the earth gave under the boot, and the hard places where the boot made a different sound. At the top of the path she stopped and turned to look at the valley, the mist still thick in the valley bottom, but beginning to thin at the edges. She started in the upper section where the katura variety grew in rows along the crest of the ridge. The katura was a compact tree with branches growing close together, and picking it required a careful hand. The fingers had to reach into the dense foliage to find the ripe cherries without damaging the unripe ones or breaking the branches. The katura cherries were small, each one about the size of her thumbnail. They grew in tight clusters along the branches, the clusters so dense that in some places the cherries appeared to form a single mass of red against the green leaves. She stopped at the first bush and bent slightly to look at the fruit. The cherries grew in clusters close to the stem, each cluster bearing several fruit, the unripe ones green and hard, the ripening ones yellow and then orange and then a deep even red. She touched one with her thumb, testing its firmness, and it gave slightly. It was ready. She began to pick, her hands moving among the branches with a motion so familiar that it required no thought. She held each cherry between thumb and forefinger and pulled gently, the ripe fruit coming away from the stem with a small resistance and then releasing. Her hands moved through the foliage with a steady rhythm, the cherries dropping into the basket on her hip with a soft sound. The first bush took about 4 minutes, the second a little less as her rhythm settled and her eyes adjusted to the pattern of ripeness on each bush. By the fourth bush she had found her pace, steady enough to cover the section efficiently but careful enough to avoid leaving ripe cherries behind. She worked in a low crouch, her knees bent and her back straight, her body positioned so the basket hung at the right height. She moved along the row with one hand holding the branches aside while the other picked, then switching, picking with both hands alternately as she had learned in her first season. It doubled the speed of the work and required a kind of two-sided attention that the years had taught her. The row she worked on was at the edge of the section where the coffee trees grew beside a stand of tall timber trees the grandmother had left standing when she cleared the land. They provided shade for the coffee and were valuable for their hard, durable wood, and the grandmother had believed that a farm should keep some of its original forest. The strip of ground between the trees and the coffee bushes received less sun, the soil cooler and damper, and the coffee bushes there grew at a different pace. The cherries took a few days longer to ripen, and she would visit this row again in a week's time, when the yellow cherries had reached their full red. Beyond the edge of the finca the land fell away into the valley, and she could see the mist below her. In an hour or two it would rise as the morning warmed, dissolving slowly into the air until the valley floor became visible again. The stream and the road and the small cluster of houses at the bend in the road would emerge from the retreating cloud. She saw all of this while she worked, her eyes on the cherries in front of her, the valley in the periphery of her vision, both awarenesses coexisting without effort. The first hour passed and she finished 4 rows of the catura section, her basket half full. The cherries made a soft sound against each other as she moved, the fruit settling in the basket. She had picked about 3 kilograms, and by the end of the day she would pick between 25 and 30 kilograms, depending on how heavy the crop was in the sections she worked. At the peak of the harvest, the first pass of the catura section, she had picked more than 35 kilograms in a single day, a record that she had not matched since. The memory of that day came back to her now and then, a particular morning when the cherries had been so heavy on the branches that she had filled her basket in half the usual time. She paused at the end of a row and straightened her back, stretching her shoulders and rolling them backward and then forward. The morning was cool enough that she was not yet sweating, her shirt still dry on her body, the air fresh and clean against her face. She took a drink from the cup of water she carried, the water cool from the stream, and looked at the rows ahead of her. The work was steady and the rhythm was good. This was what she had been doing for weeks, and what she would continue to do until the cherries were all picked. The sun had not yet risen over the eastern ridge, but the sky was fully light now, the darkness gone from the lower air. The birds had become active, their calls coming from the shade trees and the bushes at the edges of the farm, the voices of different species at this hour. She heard the call of a flycatcher from the tall tree at the corner of the section, a call of 3 notes and then silence, and then the same 3 notes. Further down the slope she heard the song of a thrush that nested in the bushes that grew along the stream. Directly above the catura section at the highest point of the farm, a single wax palm stood against the sky, a tree that had been there long before the grandmother cleared the land. It was visible from every part of the farm, a landmark that orientated the whole property, its trunk tall and smooth and pale, rising 30 meters above the canopy. The crown was a dense cluster of dark green fronds that moved in the wind with a dry rattling sound, a sound different from the sound of the other trees. She associated that sound with this specific spot on the farm. She moved down to the middle section where the Colombia variety grew, the largest section of the farm planted by her mother in the 1990s. It covered the central part of the slope where the gradient was less steep and the soil was deeper and richer. The Colombia variety was developed by the Colombian Coffee Growers Federation, and its cherries were larger than the catura, their skins slightly thicker. When she pinched one to test its ripeness, the resistance was different, and her hands adjusted automatically, the difference registering below the level of thought. She had picked in this section for more than 20 years and knew the feel of these cherries the way she knew the feel of the door handle of her house. In the space between the rows, the ground was covered in fallen leaves from the shade trees, dry and brown and crisp. As she moved along the rows, her boots made the sound of the leaves compressing, a dry, crackling sound particular to this section. The shade trees here were a species of inga that shed its leaves at a different time of year, the leaf fall happening in the late dry season. The inga trees were not native to this altitude, having been introduced by an earlier generation of coffee farmers as a source of shade and nitrogen fixation. She noticed these things as she worked, the condition of the leaf litter and the quality of the soil beneath it, whether the moisture in the row was different from yesterday. She noticed which bushes needed pruning and which had produced less fruit than expected and which had produced more. These observations accumulated over the season and across the years, building a picture of the farm that was constantly updating, a living knowledge of this piece of land. She did not write these observations down because her body held them, her hands remembering what her mind did not need to record. The morning continued, the light changing gradually as the angle of the sun shifted and the shadows of the shade trees moved across the rows. The air warmed slowly, the cool of early morning giving way to the mildness of late morning in the high tropics. She heard a truck on the road below, the engine sound rising and falling as it climbed the grade, the first vehicle of the day on the road between the valley and the town. The sound lasted for 2 or 3 minutes and then faded as the truck passed beyond the curve, the engine note diminishing until it was gone. The sun reached the edge of the valley, and she saw the light touch the top of the ridge, a sudden brightness at the highest point as the crest caught the first direct rays of the day. The light spread down the face of the ridge slowly, the bright line moving lower as the sun rose above the skyline, and the valley below gradually filled with light. The shadows became sharper, the colors of the land and the trees and the coffee bushes richer and more defined. She had been picking for nearly 3 hours, her basket nearly full as she worked through the Colombia section. The third section was planted with Castillo, the variety she had chosen and planted herself, working alone through 2 dry seasons. She remembered the work now with a feeling that was not quite pleasure, but something related to it, the memory of the physical effort and the satisfaction of seeing the new plants take hold and grow. The Castillo trees had grown well, their foliage dense, and their production in this 3rd year since the first harvest good. She finished the 3rd section and carried her full basket down to the patio, emptying it onto the clean concrete, the cherries spreading across the surface in a wave of red. She had picked most of the upper and middle sections this morning, and the piles on the patio represented about 15 kilograms of cherries. She would add to them in the afternoon. The processing began with the sorting, and she tipped the first lot of cherries onto the long wooden table under the roof of the processing area. The table was smooth and worn, its surface stained a deep reddish-brown by years of cherry juice and water. She stood at the table and sorted, her eyes scanning the pile of cherries for the ones that did not belong. The insect-damaged cherries were lighter than the sound ones, with a small hole where the coffee berry borer had entered. The bird-pecked cherries had a small wound in the skin through which the sun and rain had entered, the cherry beginning to ferment prematurely. The overripe cherries were dark and soft, their color almost black, their texture giving way too easily to pressure, and the underripe cherries were still yellow or orange, hard to the touch, their beans not fully developed. She sorted carefully because the quality of the final coffee depended on the thoroughness of the sorting. A single defective cherry could affect the flavor of an entire cup. The sorting of the morning's harvest took about 40 minutes. Her hands moved through the pile in a steady sweep, while her eyes followed them, the defective cherries lifted out and dropped into a different container. When she finished, the pile of defective cherries was small, maybe 2% of the total by weight. This was a good result. The bushes were healthy and the season had been kind. She set the defective cherries aside for the family's own consumption, the coffee that was drunk in the house during the harvest season. This coffee was not wasted, but was used for the morning cups that she and Teresa drank, coffee that was good enough for the family, even if it would not have passed the cooperative's grading. The sorted cherries went into the pulper, a machine of heavy cast iron painted green that her grandfather had bought second-hand from a larger farm in the valley above. It had been in service on this farm for more than 40 years. Some of the parts were not original and the paint was worn away in places, but it still did its work reliably. She fed the cherries into the hopper by hand, a small quantity at a time, the machine making a steady mechanical sound. Inside, the cherries passed between two moving surfaces that pressed the fruit against a fixed surface, the pressure separating the outer skin and pulp from the bean. The beans fell through into a bucket below, still covered in a layer of mucilage, while the skins and pulp were carried away by a flow of water through a channel to the collection pit. The morning's picking filled 3 buckets with pulped beans, and she carried them to the fermentation tank, a concrete tank sunk into the ground beside the patio. She poured the beans into the tank and added clean water, stirring them with a wooden paddle until they were fully covered. The beans would ferment here for the next 18 hours, the enzymes in the mucilage breaking down the layer that still clung to the parchment. She had learned the fermentation from her mother, who had learned it from the grandmother, who had learned it from a coffee grower in a neighboring valley. The grandmother had watched and asked questions and experimented, and the method she arrived at was the method Valentina still used today. She covered the tank with a top and weighted the edges with stones. The drying patio was covered with beans from the day before yesterday, spread in a thin layer on the concrete, and she walked over to them now and began to turn them. She used a wooden rake with wide tines that moved the beans across the surface, exposing the lower layer to the air. The rake had been made by her grandfather, the handle smooth from years of use, the tines worn down by the constant motion of the beans across the wood. It was the same rake her mother had used and her grandmother before her, and it would be the same rake her children would use if they chose to continue the farm. The beans were at about the 3rd day of drying and had begun to harden, the parchment around them becoming pale and brittle. The color of them was no longer the vivid red of the ripe cherry, but a pale brown, the color of dried parchment. She turned them in a steady pattern, moving the rake across the surface in long sweeps, the beans rolling and shifting. The beans from the upper section were on one side of the patio, and the beans from the middle section on the other, and she kept them separate because the Caturra and the Colombia dried at slightly different rates. The Caturra beans were smaller and dried faster, and she would move them to the raised beds a day before the Colombia beans. The turning of the beans was a daily rhythm within the larger rhythm of the harvest. She turned them 4 times a day at regular intervals, once in the early morning after the sorting, once before lunch, once in the mid-afternoon between picking sessions, and once in the evening before covering them for the night. The correct pace of drying was one of the skills she had learned from her mother, and she was still learning it because every season was different. Some years the air was dry and the beans dried quickly, requiring more frequent turning to keep the outside from hardening, while the inside stayed moist. Other years the air was humid and the beans dried slowly, requiring a thinner layer to prevent fermentation. She made these adjustments without thinking now, her eyes judging the thickness of the layer and her hands feeling the moisture in the beans. The lunch bell rang from the house, her mother's sister Teresa calling her to the midday meal. She washed her hands at the tap and walked up to the house. The water was cold on her skin, washing away the dust and the small fragments of leaf that had stuck to her hands during the morning's picking. She dried them on the cloth beside the tap and went inside. The meal was simple: rice and beans and fried plantain with a piece of chicken stewed with tomatoes and onions and fresh cilantro from the garden. It was the same meal she had eaten at this table on this day of the harvest for as long as she could remember. The same food in the same season, the flavors of the region coming together in a way that was familiar and satisfying. Her children were already at the table, brought home from the school in the village for the midday break, and they ate hungrily and talked about their morning, their voices filling the room. Mateo described a lesson about the geography of Colombia, the rivers and the mountains, and the coffee-growing regions that his teacher had drawn on the board. Gabriel was quieter, eating his food and watching the adults. She listened while she ate but did not say much. The morning's work settled into her body, the familiar heaviness in her shoulders and legs. After the meal she lay down in the hammock on the porch with her straw hat over her face, the hottest hour of the day passing over her as the farm rested. The birds were quieter at this hour, the stream lower, the air still in a way it was not at any other time. She did not sleep but lay in the gentle sway of the hammock, looking through the gap between her hat and collar at the branch of the avocado tree above the porch. The rest period was not a luxury but a necessity during the harvest, the break in the middle of the day allowing her body to recover enough to do the afternoon's work. She rose at 2:30, drank a glass of water, and climbed to the lower section with her hat and her basket. The afternoon light was different from the morning, the shadows shorter and the colors less soft, the sun high enough that it illuminated the rows from directly above. The temperature was warm but not unpleasant, and a light breeze had started to move through the valley. The afternoon picking was different from the morning, because the rhythm was already established, the body already in the pattern of the work, but the muscles were tired, and the small pains of the day were beginning to accumulate. She began in the Castillo section where the slope was gentlest and the rows were longest, the Castillo trees younger than the trees in the other sections. Their branches were more open and less dense, and the picking was easier on the hands because she could see the cherries more clearly. She worked steadily through the rows, the cherries coming away from the branches with the same small resistance they had offered in the morning. The basket filled, and she carried it down to the patio and emptied it, then went back to the Castillo section and continued picking. The afternoon passed as the sun moved across the sky and the shadows of the shade trees lengthened, the light taking on the golden quality of late afternoon. She heard her son Mateo calling to her from the house, and she answered. He came climbing up the path through the rows and told her that his grandmother had arrived and was sitting on the patio with Teresa. She smiled at this news. Her mother came to the finca most days during the harvest to help with the sorting and the drying and the quality checks. She was 64 years old and her body could no longer sustain the hours of picking. But her knowledge was still the deepest knowledge of this farm that existed. Her presence on the patio was a presence Valentina had known her whole life, one she relied on more than she sometimes fully recognized. She finished the row she was working on and came down to the patio with a full basket. Her mother was sitting on the low wall at the edge of the drying patio, a basket of sorted cherries beside her, her hands still moving through the cherries even as she sat and talked. It was the same habit that Valentina had inherited. Her mother was a small woman with gray hair pulled back and a face shaped by the sun and the wind of many years on this farm. When she saw Valentina coming down the path, she raised her hand in a small wave. Valentina emptied her basket onto the patio and sat down beside her mother. They did not speak for a moment but looked at the hillside together. The rows of coffee lay in the late afternoon light, the green of the leaves and the red of the cherries, and the long blue shadows stretching across the slope. Her mother said the Castillo section was looking well, the cherries heavier this year than last year, the quality good. Valentina said that she thought so too. The Catura section was producing more than she had expected, and the Colombia section was producing so much that she was not sure she could finish the picking in the 2 months she had planned. Her mother said she would come up tomorrow and help with the processing so Valentina could pick all day without stopping. She finished the afternoon's picking as the light began to go, coming down to the patio with her last basket and emptying it onto the pile. The pile had grown. Tomorrow morning she would process it. She walked to the fermentation tank and lifted the tarp, putting her hand into the water and feeling the beans. The mucilage was softening as expected, the surface of each bean less slippery and more textured than in the morning. She judged that they were about a third of the way through the fermentation process and would be ready by morning. Her mother had gone inside, and she followed. The kitchen was warm and bright, the children at the table, her mother setting out plates. The smell of the fish frying filled the room. The meal was rice and beans with a fish from the river below, a fish that someone had brought up from the village that afternoon, fried with garlic and lime. The fish was fresh, and the lime was from the tree in the yard, and the garlic was from the garden. The whole meal was from the farm and the valley around it. She ate slowly, listening to the voices around her. The children talked about their day at school, and their grandmother talked about the village, and Teresa talked about a disagreement between 2 neighbors that had been resolved and then flared up again. A wedding was being planned for the end of the dry season. A new road was being built on the other side of the ridge. The price of coffee was higher this year than last year. All of it was good news for the finca. She did not contribute much to the conversation, but she listened, and the sound of the people she lived with filled the room the way the smell of the cooking filled it, warm and familiar and constant. After the meal she went out to the patio one last time, the night clear and cool. The stars above the ridge were bright, more stars than she could see from the town, the lights of the village scattered across the darkness below. She stood at the edge of the patio and looked at the dark shape of the hillside. The coffee trees were invisible in the darkness, but she knew they were there, row after row of them, standing in the night and growing. The farm was a place of many layers of sound and silence in the darkness, the stream at the bottom, the wind in the shade trees, the small sounds of the animals that moved through the bamboo grove after dark. A rustle. A movement. The sound of something small crossing the path. She had grown up with these sounds and she had fallen asleep to them as a child, and she fell asleep to them still. She checked the fermentation tank one more time, lifting the tarp and putting her hand into the water. The beans were still fermenting, the mucilage continuing to break down, the surface of the beans changing texture as they softened in the water. She would check them again in the morning when the light was good and she could see them properly. She covered the tank and weighted the edges and walked back to the house. The light was still on in the kitchen, Teresa washing the last of the dishes, the children already in bed. She sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes before going to bed, not doing anything, just sitting in the quiet of the room. The stove was still warm. The dishes were stacked in the rack to dry. The clock on the wall showed 8:30. In a little more than 8 hours she would wake and begin again. She thought about the rose she would pick tomorrow and the cherries that would be ready. She thought about the beans in the fermentation tank and the beans on the drying patio and the beans that were still on the trees, waiting for her to come for them in the morning. The days of the harvest passed in this rhythm, one after another, the same pattern repeating across the weeks. The morning picking, the afternoon picking, the processing, the drying, the sleep, and the waking again in the dark to do it all over. The piles of drying beans grew, and then shrank as they reached the correct moisture, and were moved into storage. The fermentation tank filled and emptied and filled again, the pulper humming each morning and afternoon. The farm was a small engine of production, and she was the person who kept it running. But the days were not all the same. Some days the picking was heavier, and she worked through the rows faster, the ripe cherries coming away from the branches in greater numbers. Other days the picking was lighter and she moved more slowly, the cherries fewer and more scattered, the work more like searching than harvesting. Some days the processing was quick, the cherries sorting easily and the pulper running smoothly, the whole morning's work done before the lunch bell rang. Other days the machine jammed and she had to stop and clean it, losing half an hour to the repair while the cherries sat in the basket and the water ran through the channel. Some days the weather was fine and the beans dried well, the sun strong and the air dry enough that she could see the moisture leaving the beans as she turned them. Other days the clouds came and she had to cover the patio before the rain arrived, the tarp spread across the concrete in a matter of minutes, the beans safe for another day. The rhythm was the same but the details shifted, and the details were what made the work feel different each day even though the pattern never changed. The piles of beans on the patio changed over the weeks. In the morning of the first day there was nothing. By the end of the first week there was a thin layer covering a corner of the concrete. By the second week the patio was half covered. At the peak of the harvest, 3 weeks in, every available surface was covered in beans in some stage of drying. The concrete patio was full and the raised beds were full and there were beans on top spread on the ground beside the processing area. The farm smelled of drying parchment, a sweet and earthy smell that was present in the air from morning to night. Then the first batch was moved into storage, and the patio began to clear, the beans moving from the drying beds to the storage room in a steady flow that continued until the last batch was bagged and stored. The second pass began 2 weeks after the first. The cherries that had been late to ripen were now at their peak, the bushes lighter now that the first pick had removed the bulk of the fruit. She could see the structure of each tree more clearly, the branches that had been hidden behind the weight of the cherries now visible. The second pass was more selective than the first, the pace slower, the work more deliberate. She carried her machete with her on this pass, and when she saw a branch that had died or a sucker growing from the base of a tree, she stopped and cut it away. The work of maintenance was woven into the work of picking, and a good picker was also a good caretaker. Through the second pass her mornings followed the same pattern, but the work was quieter now. The urgency that had driven her through the first pass had eased. She no longer felt the pressure to move quickly from one bush to the next, to fill the basket as fast as possible before the heat of the day made the work harder. The crop was under control. The bulk of the harvest was in. The second pass was the time for the details. The pressure to get the cherries off the trees before they over-ripened was still there, but it was not as sharp as it had been in the first weeks. She could afford to move a little more slowly, to give each tree a little more attention. She did not measure her progress by the weight of her basket, but by the thoroughness of her attention to each tree. The second pass gave her an opportunity to see the farm in a different way. With the weight of the first harvest removed, she could see the structure of each tree more clearly. She noticed which trees had produced well and which had not. She noticed where the shade from the inga trees was too dense and where it was too thin, where the light was not reaching the lower branches and the cherries on those branches had not ripened. She noticed where the soil had become compacted by the rain and needed to be turned. She noticed where the weeds had begun to grow through the leaf litter and needed to be pulled. The second pass was not just a harvest. It was also an inspection, a survey of the farm's condition after the first wave of the season. She carried her machete with her on this pass, and when she saw a branch that had died or a sucker growing from the base of a tree where it did not belong, she stopped and cut it away. The work of maintenance was woven into the work of picking, and a good picker was also a good caretaker. The time she spent cutting away a dead branch now was time that would save her from struggling with it in the next season, when the new growth would have tangled around it and made the removal more difficult. In the third week of the harvest, the rain came for 2 days. It was not the light rain of the early morning, but a steady rain that began in the night and continued without stopping. The paths became too muddy for safe work on the steep sections, and the cherries could not be picked wet because the water on the fruit would interfere with the processing. She spent the 2 days working under the roof of the processing area, cleaning the pulper and organizing the drying beds and sorting through the defective cherries that had accumulated. The children were home from school because the rain had closed the road, and their voices carried across the patio as they played in the house. She watched the rain fall on the valley and thought about the cherries that would be waiting for her when the sky cleared. When the rain stopped on the third morning, the air was fresh and the cherries were bright on the bushes, and she picked with a renewed energy that carried her through the rest of the week. In the third week of the harvest, Valentina's neighbor Eduardo came up to help. He ran a small finca on the lower slopes of the valley, his farm smaller than El Silencio because the altitude was lower and the soil was thinner. They had a standing arrangement. During the peak of the harvest, he would come up for 3 days, and later she would go down to his farm and help with his harvest. He arrived at dawn, walking up the road from the village, a man of about 60 with a face that the sun and wind had creased over many years. His picking style was different from hers, more horizontal and sweeping, not as thorough on each individual bush, but equally effective. They worked well together, knowing each other's pace from years of working side by side. They started in the Colombia section, Eduardo on one side of the row and Valentina on the other. The presence of another person added a second layer to the work, the awareness of where he was and how far ahead or behind. They did not talk much. A few words about the quality of the cherries this year. A comment about the weather. The silence of the picking was the same silence, the only sounds being the hands and the leaves and the falling cherries. By the end of the 3 days he had picked nearly 60 kilograms of cherries. She paid him in coffee, as was the custom, 10 kilograms of dried parchment coffee that he would sell to the buyer in the town. In the fourth week, a young woman from the cooperative came up the road on a motorbike. She was writing a report about the coffee-growing families of the valley, and she interviewed Valentina on the patio in the afternoon light. She asked about the history of the farm and the varieties of coffee, and the challenges of growing coffee at this altitude. Valentina answered as well as she could, telling the story of the 3 generations of women. The grandmother, who cleared the first section with a machete. The mother who built the stone house. The Castillo section that Valentina had planted herself. The young woman took photographs of the drying beds and the pulper and the view of the valley, and she took a photograph of Valentina standing beside the wax palm at the top of the section. After she left, Valentina thought about the interview and found that she had liked telling the story of the farm. Her son Matteo was 9 years old and had begun to take an interest in the work. He came out to the patio in the afternoons after school and watched her processing the cherries, asking questions about what she was doing and why. She let him help with the sorting, showing him how to identify the defective cherries. She showed him the hole where the borer had entered and the difference in weight between a sound cherry and a defective one. His hands were small and quick, and he wanted to do it well, and she saw in him the same thing her mother must have seen in her when she had sat at this same table as a child. Her younger son Gabriel was 6 and less interested in the sorting. He preferred to watch the water move in the channel that carried the pulp away from the pulper, his attention held by the movement of it. Valentina watched her sons and thought about her own childhood. She had been like Gabriel, the boy who watched the water. The farm had entered her through her eyes and her ears, not through her hands. She had learned the names of the birds and the shapes of the leaves before she had learned to pick a cherry. When the time came for her to take over the farm, she had carried that knowledge with her, the knowledge of a child who had paid attention to the world without knowing that she was paying attention. In the 5th week, her mother stayed at the finca for 3 days. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, walking up the road from the village with a small bag over her shoulder. She was smaller than Valentina remembered her, the years shrinking her the way they shrank everyone who lived long enough. But her eyes were the same, and her hands were the same. The way she stood at the edge of the patio and looked up at the hillside was the same way she had stood and looked at it for 60 years. She slept in the small room that had been her room when she lived in this house, the bed made up and the window open to the sound of the stream. In the morning she was up before Valentina, dressed and ready, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee in her hand. She had been coming to the finca during the harvest for as long as Valentina could remember, and she knew the rhythm of it as well as Valentina did. They processed the morning's cherries together, her mother at the sorting table and Valentina at the pulper. They worked in the same rhythm they had worked in when Valentina was a child, back when Valentina had sat at the sorting table and her mother had stood where she was standing now. Her mother talked about the early years of the farm, the grandmother still alive, the finca with only one section, the old wattle and daub house that leaked when the rain came from the east. The story of the frost that killed the bourbon trees in the winter of '98, the cold coming down the mountain in a single night and turning the leaves black by morning. The year the price fell so low the family almost lost the farm, the grandmother walking to the town to speak to the bank manager, coming back with the news that the loan had been extended. The planting of the inga trees that the grandmother did in a single week. She carried the seedlings up from the village and planted them along the boundaries of the sections, the work so hard that she had to stop and rest every few rows. The grandmother had watched and asked questions and experimented, and the knowledge she gathered was the foundation of everything Valentina knew now. On the 3rd day, her mother went to the upper section to look at the katura trees. She walked up the path slowly, stopping to look at a branch here and a cluster of leaves there, her eyes moving across the trees with the same attention she had always given them. When she came back down, she said the trees looked good. She said the pruning Valentina had done was the right pruning, that the shape of the trees was better than in previous years. She said the farm was in good hands. Valentina did not say anything, but she heard it. While her mother was at the finca, she found things to do that Valentina had not thought to do. On the first day she cleaned the collection pit, picking up the shovel and digging out the wet pulp in dark shovelfuls without being asked. On the second day she repaired the wooden paddle Valentina used for stirring the fermentation tank. The handle had been loose for 2 days, and her mother carved a new wedge from a piece of timber until the handle was firm again. On the 3rd day she sorted the pile of defective cherries Valentina had been setting aside for weeks. When she finished, she reported that the defects were mostly from the lower part of the Colombia section, where the humidity near the stream was higher. The trees there might need more pruning to let the air circulate better. A few days before the end of the harvest, she did the cupping. She had been setting aside samples of each batch and had enough for a proper tasting. She roasted a small sample of each variety in a frying pan on the wood stove, the first crack of the roasting audible in the quiet kitchen as the color changed from pale green to yellow to light brown. She ground the roasted beans and put them in separate cups, pouring hot water over the grounds and waiting for 4 minutes before breaking the crust with a spoon. The aroma of each variety was different. The Caturra bright and citrusy, the Colombia deep and chocolatey, the Castillo balanced between them. The Caturra was bright and clean with a sweetness that came through at the front of the palate, a hint of citrus in it, the body light and the aftertaste clean and short. The Colombia was heavier, more chocolate in the flavor, a thicker sweetness that lay across the tongue and stayed, the finish long. The Castillo was balanced and even, not as bright as the Caturra and not as heavy as the Colombia, a mild nuttiness to it. It was not a coffee that would win a competition, but it was solid and reliable, the kind of coffee a buyer could count on year after year. She wrote down her notes in the small notebook that had her mother's handwriting on earlier pages and her grandmother's handwriting on the pages before that. The notebook was kept on the shelf beside the stove, brought out only for the cupping at the end of each harvest. It recorded the character of each year, the particular expression of El Silencio in each season. She wrote the date and the variety and her impressions, the words describing the flavor and the body and the finish. The season had been good. The quality was high. She closed the notebook and put it back on the shelf. The third pass took 10 days, longer than the first 2 because the cherries were spread more thinly across the sections. Some rows yielded only a handful of cherries and others yielded a full basket, and she could not predict which was which. She had to walk every row to find out. There was no skipping a row, because one never knew which bush had held its fruit longest, which cherry had ripened late in the shade of a particular inga tree. She worked through the Castillo section first, the youngest trees, the ones that had been planted last and were still learning the rhythm of this place. Then the Caturra, the oldest trees, the ones the grandmother had planted on the crest of the ridge. Then the Colombia, the largest section, the trees that had given the most of the harvest. She was noticing things she had not noticed in the earlier passes now that her eyes were not focused on the density of the fruit. A bird's nest hidden in the fork of a Caturra bush, the nest empty, the young birds having fledged and left. A patch of moss growing on the trunk of an inga tree, a deep green against the grey bark, the moss wet from the morning mist. The way the light fell through the leaves of the shade trees in the late afternoon. The pattern of it shifted as the sun moved lower, the shadows changing in a way she had not had time to notice during the urgent days of the first pass. The harvest had been a way of being fully present on this piece of land, day after day, from the first light of the morning to the last light of the evening. At the end, when the urgency had passed, she saw the farm differently. On the final day of the third pass, she picked the last cherries of the harvest. There were about 20 or 30 of them, scattered across a bush at the edge of the Colombia section where the finca ended and the neighbor's pasture began. She picked them carefully, one at a time, and when she had picked the last one she stood and looked at the bush. The branches were empty and the leaves were green in the afternoon light. The harvest was over. The next day she began the final processing. The last batch of cherries was brought down from the storage baskets and tipped onto the sorting table. There was not much of it, perhaps 10 kilograms in total, the final yield of the third pass. She sorted through it carefully, taking her time because there was no need to hurry now. The season was over and the last batch deserved the same attention as the first. She fed the cherries through the pulper, the machine making its steady mechanical sound in the quiet of the morning. The beans fell into the bucket and she carried them to the fermentation tank and added water and stirred them. She checked them the next morning and they were ready, the mucilage broken down, the parchment feeling clean. She washed them and spread them across the raised drying beds in a thin layer. She turned them 4 times a day for the next week and watched the moisture leave them. The color changed from wet yellow parchment to hard dry brown, the surface of the beans becoming pale and brittle. She tested them each evening by biting down on one, the bean cracking cleanly between her teeth. The color of the inside was a pale greenish-white that indicated complete and even drying. On the 7th day she bit down, and the bean cracked the way it was supposed to crack, and she knew it was done. She packed the dried beans into woven polypropylene sacks, 40 kilograms to each sack. The sacks were a standard size that the cooperative accepted, a size that the mills were set up to handle. Each sack took about 20 minutes to fill and seal. The beans poured in from the bucket and then settled by lifting and dropping the sack gently on the ground. She made sure the beans were packed evenly, the sack neither too loose nor too tight, the weight of it familiar in her hands. She wrote the date and the variety and the section on each sack with a permanent marker, the letters clear and readable. The Castillo bags went in one stack against the wall of the storage room. The Caturra went in another stack beside them. The Colombia went in a third stack against the opposite wall. The coffee from each variety would be processed separately at the cooperative mill, the different varieties requiring different handling during the milling and grading. The information on the bags would follow the coffee through every stage of the process, from the receiving dock at the mill to the export lot. She worked through the stacking systematically, lifting each sack into place, adjusting the stack so that it was stable. The storage room filled with the stacks of sacks, the scent of the dried parchment filling the room. When she had finished, she stood in the doorway and looked at what she had done. 42 sacks from the 3 sections of El Silencio, stacked against the walls of the room that her grandfather had built for this purpose. The room was full. The harvest was stored. She stood in the doorway of the storage room and counted the bags again to be sure. 42 sacks from the 3 sections of El Silencio. The Castillo yielded 12 sacks, the Caturra 17, and the Colombia 13, the largest section producing the most. The whole of the harvest was there, each bag representing a particular day or a particular part of the farm. She closed the door on them and left them in the cool dark of the room. A week later, Carlos from the cooperative came with his truck and 2 men to help load. The men carried the 42 sacks out of the storage room and stacked them in the back of the truck. They worked quickly, each of them taking a sack and carrying it across the yard and lifting it onto the bed. Carlos arranged them in a careful stack and tied a tarp over the load, the ropes secured to the hooks on the sides of the truck bed. The beans shifted inside the sacks as they were moved, the sound of the parchment against the fabric a sound that was particular to the end of the harvest. The truck was loaded by mid-morning. Carlos gave Valentina a receipt with the handwritten details, the number of bags and the varieties, and the estimated weight and the price per kilogram that had been agreed at the beginning of the season. He told her the payment would be deposited in the cooperative account by the end of the week. The receipt was a slip of paper with the cooperative's letterhead, and she folded it and put it in the pocket of her shirt. She would keep it there until she went to the village and checked the account at the small bank office beside the square. Carlos shook her hand and said the coffee had been good this year. The samples he had taken from each batch had cupped well, and the buyers in Europe would be pleased. He said the cooperative had heard from the roastery in the city that the coffee from this region was in demand, the altitude and the volcanic soil giving it a character that the market was looking for. If the quality of the next harvest was as good, the cooperative could negotiate an even better price. She watched the truck drive down the road. It rounded the curve and passed behind the grove of bamboo, and then it was gone. The sound of the diesel engine faded as the truck descended toward the village, the note of it diminishing until the sound was gone too. The valley was quiet. The 42 sacks of coffee from El Silencio were on their way to the cooperative mill in the town, where they would be milled and graded and prepared for the export market. The coffee from her farm would travel further than she had ever traveled. It would go to the city and then to a port and then across the ocean. It would go to a country she had never seen, where people she would never meet would drink it and taste the particular character of this slope and this season and her hands. The farm was quiet now. The pulper was silent. The fermentation tank was empty and clean. The drying beds were bare, and the storage room was empty. The rows of coffee bushes on the hillside were a uniform dark green, the red of the cherries gone, the harvest complete. She stood in the yard and looked at the hillside, the valley green and quiet, the mist rising from the valley floor. The silence was different from the silence of a single moment. It was the silence of a season ending, of a machine that had been running for weeks finally stopping. The quiet after the harvest was a particular quality of silence that she had known every year since she was old enough to understand the harvest. It was the silence of completion. The next day she walked down to the village to check the cooperative account. The road descended through the coffee farms of the upper valley, past the fincas she knew, the names of the families who lived there familiar the way everything in this valley was familiar. She passed Eduardo's farm on the lower slopes, the trees smaller than hers, the section that he had planted last year visible from the road. She passed the school where the children went, the building quiet because it was the weekend. She passed the church and the square and arrived at the bank office. The bank office was a small room beside the square, with a single desk against the wall and a filing cabinet in the corner. The woman behind the desk was called Sarah, and she had worked there for as long as Valentina could remember. She handled the accounts for all the coffee farmers in the valley, and she knew the amount of every harvest payment before she looked at the receipt. Valentina gave her the receipt from Carlos and Sarah, checked the account on the computer, the screen glowing blue in the dim room. She nodded. The payment had arrived. The amount was higher than the previous year, and Sarah printed a statement and handed it across the desk. The paper was warm from the printer. Valentina folded it and put it in her pocket. She walked out of the office and stood in the square for a moment, the receipt and the statement sitting against her hip. The amount would cover the children's school for the next year, and the repairs to the roof, and a new motor for the pulper that she had been putting off for 2 years. She crossed the square and sat on a bench under the trees, watching the people of the village moving through the morning. A woman was sweeping the steps of the church, the broom making a steady sound against the stone. A man was unloading sacks of rice from the back of a truck, stacking them on the ground beside the road. A dog lay in the shade of the wall, sleeping in the morning cool. Children walked past on their way to school, their voices bright in the quiet of the square. An old man she knew by sight sat on the bench on the other side of the square, reading a newspaper. The village was waking and moving through its morning, and she was part of it, a woman who had brought her harvest to completion, and was sitting on a bench in the square, with the receipt in her pocket. She sat for a long time, not thinking about anything in particular. The receipt and the statement were in her pocket, and the knowledge of what the harvest had brought was settling into her body the way the harvest itself had settled into her muscles over the weeks of the picking. The amount on the statement was enough. It was not more than enough, but it was enough. It would cover the school fees and the roof repairs and the new pulper motor. It would leave a little to put aside for the years when the harvest was smaller or the price was lower. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the morning of the village move around her. She would rest for 2 weeks. She would sleep later in the mornings and spend time with the children. She would visit her mother and they would sit in the garden and drink coffee from the finca. The 2 weeks would pass, and she would begin the pruning, and the cycle would continue, the same cycle it had followed for 70 years on this slope. The pruning began in the 3rd week after the harvest. The 2 weeks of rest had passed quietly, the mornings slow, the afternoons spent with the children and with her mother. She had sat in the garden at her mother's house and drunk coffee from the finca, the two of them talking about the harvest and the price and the year ahead. Now the rest was over and the work of the off-season had begun. She did the pruning in the mornings when the light was good. The mornings were cooler now, the harvest heat passed, and she wore a long-sleeved shirt against the morning chill. She walked up to the catura section with the shears in her hand, the dew wet on the grass, the hillside quiet in the early light. The shears were cold in her hand when she began each day, and the sound of them was a sharp metallic sound that carried across the hillside in the quiet of the morning. The neighbors in the valley below could hear it, a sound that told them the pruning season had begun on El Silencio. She started each morning in the catura section, where the oldest trees required the most careful attention. Their branches were thick and heavy, and the decisions about which branch to cut and which to keep were more consequential than with the younger trees. She worked slowly on these trees, stepping back after each cut to look at the shape of it. She assessed the balance of the canopy, the way the light would enter the center of the tree after the branch was removed. The youngest trees in the Castillo section were easier, their growth more predictable and their structure still forming. She moved through them more quickly, her hands and the shears working in a rhythm she had developed for this type of tree. The work of pruning was a work of foresight. The decisions she made now would determine the shape of each tree for the next 5 years, and the quality of the harvest for those years would be influenced by the decisions she made with the pruning shears. A branch cut too close to the trunk would leave a wound that would take years to heal. A branch left in place that was growing inward or crossing another branch would reduce the yield of that section of the tree. Each cut was a small decision in a larger pattern, and the pattern was the future shape of the farm. The pruning took 3 weeks, and when it was complete she stood at the bottom of the lower section and looked up at the hillside. The trees had a clean look to them now, the dead wood gone, the inward growing branches removed. The shape of each tree was open and balanced, the canopy receiving light evenly across its surface. She walked up through the sections to check her work, moving through the rows and looking at the cuts she had made. Each cut had been made at the right angle and the right distance from the trunk. Each cut was clean and would heal well. The trees would rest through the wet season and grow, and when the next harvest came, the new growth would carry the fruit. When the pruning was complete, she began the fertilizing. She mixed the organic fertilizer from the materials she had been collecting through the harvest and the weeks after. Decomposed coffee pulp from the collection pit, dark and rich, broken down by months of sitting in the pit. Manure from the neighbor's cows, brought up from the pasture below in buckets, the smell of it strong and familiar. Ash from the wood stove, the fine gray powder that remained after the morning fires of the wet season. She mixed them in a large container beside the collection pit, turning the materials together with a shovel until the mixture was even. The smell of it was rich and earthy, the smell of decomposition and renewal. She carried the fertilizer in a large bucket with a small shovel and walked through the sections tree by tree. The bucket was heavy on her arm, and she switched it from one hand to the other as she worked, the muscles in her shoulders and arms remembering the weight from the years before. At each tree she stopped and bent and spread a shovelful in a ring around the trunk. The ring extended to the edge of the canopy where the feeding roots were thickest, and she took care to make it even, the material distributed evenly around the base of the tree. In the Katura section, the ring had to be wider because the roots spread further in the thin soil near the crest of the ridge. The trees had to search harder for nutrients here, and their roots reached further. She spread the ring wider at each tree, the extra work taking more time per tree, but the extra time necessary for the health of the trees. In the Colombia section, the soil was deeper and richer, and the ring could be tighter, the nutrients staying closer to the trunk. In the Castillo section, the trees were younger, and their root systems were still developing, and she placed the fertilizer carefully, close enough for the young roots to reach, but not so close that it would burn them. The Catura section took 4 days, the Colombia 3, and the Castillo 2. Each day she worked through a section of the farm, row by row, tree by tree. By the end of each day her shoulders ached from the carrying and the bending. But the work was the work of returning to the soil what the season had taken from it, and there was a satisfaction in that, a feeling of balance and completion that came from closing the circle. The nutrients that the trees had used to produce the cherries were coming back to the soil. The rain would come in the weeks ahead and carry the nutrients down into the root zone, and the roots would find them there. The trees would grow through the wet season, drawing on the nutrients she had placed around them, and they would produce the new growth that would become the next year's crop. The cycle of the farm was a closed circle, the waste of the harvest becoming the food of the next harvest, and she was the person who closed the circle. She carried the nutrients from the collection pit to the base of each tree, and in doing so she completed the work of the season. The fertilizer would feed the trees, and the trees would produce the cherries, and the cherries would become the harvest, and the waste of the harvest would become the fertilizer again. The circle turned without beginning or end. The grandmother had cleared the first section and planted the first trees. The mother had built the house and expanded the farm. Valentina pruned and fertilized and harvested and dried. Her children would do the same or they would not. The circle did not depend on them. It would turn with them or without them. But for now she was here, and the work was here, and the soil was rich, and the trees were healthy, and the flowers were on the branches. The circle was turning, and she was part of it. The wet season arrived in the 8th week after the harvest. The rain began in the night, a steady rain that continued through the next day and the day after that. The valley filled with the sound of water falling, the stream rising until it was running faster and deeper than she had seen it in months. The coffee trees received the rain on their leaves and on their roots, and the farm entered the season of rest. The first day of the wet season was always a relief. The dry season had lasted long enough, the dust building on the leaves of the coffee trees and the earth between the rows cracking in the heat. The rain washed the dust away and the earth softened, and the air became clear and cool. The farm breathed again. She woke later now, the sun already above the ridge when she opened her eyes, the room filled with a grey light and the sound of rain on the roof. She lay in bed and listened to the rhythm of it, the sound changing with the intensity of the rain, a soft patter when it was light and a heavy drumming when it was strong. She did not get up immediately because there was no need to. The day would unfold at its own pace. She listened to the rain and thought about the coffee trees on the hillside above the house, the water running down their leaves and into the soil at their roots. The rain was what they needed. The rain was what would make the next harvest. She spent the mornings on the porch in the hammock, under the roof that kept the rain off, reading books from the small library in the village, or just watching the rain fall on the valley. The books had been on the shelves for years, and she had read them before. Some were so worn that the spines were cracked, and the pages soft at the edges. The books that everyone in the valley had read, passed from one house to the next. She read a chapter a day, sometimes two, never hurrying. The afternoons she spent in the kitchen, cooking the soups and stews that the wet season called for. She made sancocho with chicken from the farm and plantain from along the stream, the soup thick and yellow, served with rice and avocado. She cooked the beans that had been dried from the garden, simmering them slowly with herbs from beside the door. Teresa helped with the cooking, the two of them working side by side in the warm kitchen, the children at the table, the rain falling outside. Teresa talked about the village, the people who had married, and the people who had died, and the people who had moved away to the city and come back. Valentina listened and stirred the pot and added salt, and tasted and added more. The kitchen was warm when she was cooking, the stove lit, the windows steamed. The children sat at the table and did their homework, their voices filling the room while the rain filled the world outside. On Sunday during the wet season, she took the children to visit her mother in the village. They walked down the road together in the morning, the rain having stopped for the moment, the clouds still low over the valley. Her mother's house was at the edge of the village, a small house with a garden and a view of the valley. The garden was full of the flowers that bloomed in the wet season, red and yellow and orange, the colors bright against the gray of the sky. The children ran ahead to the gate, and her mother came out to meet them, drying her hands on her apron. They sat in the garden and drank coffee from the finca. The coffee was from the last harvest, the one she had kept for the family, and her mother said it was the best it had been in years. The children played in the garden while the women talked, the conversation moving from the harvest to the children to the village to the weather. The rain began again and they moved inside, sitting at the kitchen table with the sound of the rain on the roof, and the windows steamed up from the heat of the stove. In the afternoon they walked back up the road, the children tired, the visit over. The week would begin again tomorrow. The evenings during the wet season were the quietest hours of the day. She sat with the children on the porch after the evening meal, watching the rain fall into the darkness. Sometimes the rain was light, and the sound of it was soft, a gentle patter on the roof that blended with the sound of the stream. Other nights the rain was heavy, and the sound of it was loud, filling the whole valley with the noise of water falling. On those nights the children did not talk, and they sat together in the darkness, listening to the rain. The stream was loud in the night, the water running fast, the sound of it rising through the mist that hung over the valley. The mist was thick in the wet season, so thick that she could not see the lights of the village from the edge of the patio. The farm was isolated in the darkness, surrounded by the mist and the rain and the sound of the water. She did not find this isolating. She found it peaceful. The farm was reduced to its simplest elements in the wet season: the house and the coffee trees and the stream and the rain. Everything else was hidden by the mist. Sometimes the rain stopped and the night was still, the clouds clearing to reveal the stars above the ridge. The children asked questions about the farm during these quiet hours. Matteo wanted to know when the next harvest would begin, and she told him it would begin when the dry season came and the cherries turned red. He asked how she knew when they were ready, and she told him she touched them and felt the firmness of them and knew from the feel. Gabriel wanted to know if the hummingbirds would return, and she told him they would, that they always returned when the inga trees flowered. He asked how she knew, and she said she had been watching them for a long time, and they had never missed a year. She answered their questions and they sat together in the darkness, the cool air settling around them, the sounds of the farm continuing into the night. The sounds of the farm changed in the wet season. The stream was louder, the water running higher and faster, the sound of it filling the space that had been occupied by the sounds of the harvest. The roof carried the sound of the rain in a steady percussion that varied with its intensity. The wind in the shade trees was a different wind, the leaves heavy with water, the sound of them lower and more sustained. The birds changed too. The species that had been vocal during the harvest were quiet now, and new birds appeared that she did not see in the dry season. A small bird with a brown back and a pale chest called from the bamboo grove in the early mornings, a two-note call, the first note higher than the second, repeated 3 times. She listened for it each morning. It was a marker of time, telling her that the wet season was in its middle and that the flowers would soon appear. Gabriel sat on the step and watched the hummingbirds that came to the flowers near the house. The birds moved from flower to flower with quick, darting motions, pausing in the air for a moment before moving to the next. He watched them for long periods of time. She sat beside him sometimes and watched them too, and she remembered sitting on the same step as a child, watching the same birds come to the same flowers. She walked the farm less during the wet season. The paths were muddy, and the effort of crossing the sections was more than it was worth. She watched the farm from the house and the porch, the green of the coffee deepening, the leaves of the inga trees dark and glossy, the grass growing long and wild between the rows. The farm did not stop. The coffee trees were still growing, their roots drawing water from the soil, their leaves absorbing the moisture from the air. One day a week she walked down to the village. The walk took about 40 minutes, the road descending through the coffee farms of the upper valley and then into the pasture lands below. She passed the farms she knew, the names of the families who lived there, the boundaries where one finca ended and another began. She knew whose coffee was planted on each slope and whose cattle grazed in each pasture, and she knew the condition of each farm from the appearance of the trees as she passed. She went to the small shop near the square, the shop that sold the supplies the coffee farmers needed. Pruning shears and pulper belts and mesh for the drying beds and woven bags for storage. The woman who ran it knew every grower in the region. She saw Valentina coming and had the things ready on the counter. They talked about the season and the price and the weather, the conversation of 2 people who had known each other for a long time and did not need to fill every moment with talk. On one visit she bought new mesh for the drying beds, the old one worn through in one corner. She paid and wrapped the mesh in plastic to keep it dry and walked back up the road through the rain, the mesh under her arm. The rain was steady and the road was wet, the water running in the gullies at the edges. She passed the church at the edge of the village, the white tower rising above the red roof, the bells silent because they only rang on Sundays. She passed the houses with their gardens and their washing lines, the smoke of cooking fires mixing with the mist in the air. At the finca, she cut away the old mesh from the drying bed frame and cleaned the frame of the debris that had collected under it. Small dried beans and fragments of parchment and dust that had accumulated over the season. She brushed them away with her hand and laid the new mesh across the frame. She stretched it tight and stapled it into place, the staples going in cleanly. She ran her hand across the surface. It was smooth and even. The drying beds were ready for the next harvest. In the middle of the wet season, the coffee trees flowered. The flowers appeared after a period of rain, the small white blossoms opening in the morning and covering the hillside with a color like new snow. The flowering began on the Katura section first and spread through the whole farm within a week, the white blossoms massed on the branches of every tree. She walked up to the upper section on the morning the flowers opened. She stood among the Katura trees in the wet grass, the flowers on every branch, the white so dense that the green of the leaves was nearly hidden. The smell of it filled the air around her, like jasmine but lighter, the smell of the coming harvest. She touched a flower with her fingertip, the petals thin and white and soft, softer than she had expected. She had held coffee flowers before, many times, in every wet season of her adult life. But each time they surprised her with their delicacy, so unlike the hard red cherries that would follow. The flower would fall from the tree within a few days, the petals drifting down through the canopy to land on the ground between the coffee rows. For a few days the ground would be covered in white, and then the petals would brown and dry and the wind would take them away. Where each flower had fallen, a small green fruit would form, no larger than a grain of rice at first. It would grow through the rest of the wet season, swelling slowly at first and then faster as the weeks passed. It would grow through the early part of the dry season, changing color from green to yellow to orange. And in the time of the next harvest, if the rains came at the right time, and the sun shone at the right time, it would become the cherry that she would pick. She thought about how many flowers it took to make a harvest. Each tree had hundreds of flowers and each section had hundreds of trees, and the whole farm had 3 sections. Every flower that opened on every branch of every tree was a potential cherry, a potential drop of the red that she would pick in the time of the harvest. Most of them would not make it. Some would fall before they were pollinated. Some would be taken by the birds that lived in the inga trees and the bamboo grove. Some would fail to develop and would dry on the branch and fall without ever becoming anything. The few that survived, the ones that grew and ripened and turned red in the light of the dry season, were the ones she would pick. They were the fruit of the work of the whole year, the pruning and the fertilizing and the weeding and the watching. She thought about this as she stood among the flowers, the petals soft against her fingers, the smell of them in the air around her. The harvest was the small fraction of the flowering that made it all the way through, and that was enough. It was more than enough. The 42 sacks of coffee that she had sent to the cooperative were made of flowers that had survived everything that could have stopped them. She had survived with them. She walked back down to the house and sat on the step of the back door, looking at the hillside, the flowers, the beginning of something she knew well. The cycle of the farm was the cycle of her life, and the cycle was repeating itself as it had always done. She was part of it, moving with it the way the stream moved with the current, the way the mist moved with the wind. The planting and the growing and the flowering and the harvest, the pruning and the fertilizing and the rest, the rain and the sun and the mist in the valley. She had lived this cycle her whole life and she would live it for the rest of her life, and the cycle would continue after her as it had before her. She thought about what it meant to be part of something that would go on without her. The grandmother had started it. The mother had carried it. Valentina was carrying it now. One day Matteo or Gabriel would carry it, or someone else would, or the land would be sold and the coffee trees would be replaced by something else, and the cycle would end on this slope. She did not know what would happen, and she did not need to know. The work was the same whether she knew the future or not. The flowers were on the trees and the fruit would follow and the harvest would come. The work of the person who was here now was the only work that mattered. She was that person. The finca would not always be hers. Nothing was always anyone's. The grandmother had owned it and died. The mother had owned it and passed it on. Valentina owned it now, but she would not own it forever. The time would come when she would pass it on, or it would pass from her in some other way. When that time came, she wanted to know that she had taken care of it. She wanted the soil to be richer than she had found it, and the trees to be healthier, and the farm to be in better condition than when she had received it. That was what the fertilizing was for. That was what the pruning was for. That was what the careful picking and the thorough sorting and the patient drying were for. She was taking care of something that would outlast her. The grandmother had begun this cycle when she bought the land in the early 50s. She was a young woman then, alone in a valley that was still mostly forest, the road impassable in the wet season, and the nearest town a full day's walk away. She had cleared the first section herself with a machete and planted the first bourbon trees that she had carried from the nursery in a basket on her back. She had not known whether the farm would succeed. No one had known. The soil was untested at this altitude, and the varieties were new to this slope, and the weather in this valley was different from the weather in the valleys where coffee had been grown before. But she had trusted that it would succeed, and she had been right. The mother had continued it, expanding the farm and building the house, learning from the grandmother, and passing that learning on. Valentina was continuing it now, and one day her children would continue it after her unless they chose another path. She had told them they were free to do that. The farm did not ask for a promise. It asked for the work of the person who was here now. That person was her. She thought about the grandmother sometimes when she was working in the upper section. The grandmother had walked these same rows when they were newly planted, the trees small and young, the future uncertain. She had pruned them with the same kind of shears Valentina used now. She had picked the cherries from them with her own hands. She had fed the same pulper, and stirred the same fermentation tank, and turned the beans on the same drying patio. The grandmother had done all of this before Valentina was born, and Valentina was doing it now, and the work connected them across the years in a way that she did not need to talk about or even think about. It was there in the shape of the land, in the layout of the rows, in the knowledge of how to feel a cherry to know if it was ready. The grandmother was present in all of these things. She went inside and made coffee from the last harvest, the one she had kept for the family, and sat at the kitchen table looking through the window at the farm that was hers to take care of. The coffee tasted of the place where it had grown, of the slope and the altitude and the particular character of the Katura section, the trees the grandmother had planted on the ridge above the house. She held the cup and breathed in the steam, the smell of it filling her nose and her mouth before she had even taken a sip. All of it was in the cup. The altitude and the soil and the rain of the wet season and the sun of the dry season. The pruning shears and the sorting table and the fermentation tank and the drying beds. The turning of the beans 4 times each day. The 42 sacks stacked in the storage room. The truck driving down the road with the tarp tied over the load. The receipt folded in the drawer of the dresser in her bedroom. The statement from the bank office. All of it was there in the cup, in the taste of the coffee that she had grown and picked and processed and dried with her own hands. She held the cup and looked at the hillside, the flowers on the coffee trees becoming the cherries that would become the next harvest. She thought about the months ahead. The flowers would fall and the fruit would form, and the small green cherries would appear where each flower had been. They would grow slowly at first, and then faster as the wet season progressed. They would change color as the dry season approached, and in the late dry season the first red cherries would appear on the Katura trees at the top of the ridge. She would walk up to check on them and touch them to test their firmness, and she would know from the feel of them when the harvest was ready to begin. She finished her coffee and rinsed the cup, placing it in the rack beside the other cups that had been washed and left to dry. They belonged to the kitchen of the house that her mother had built, the house that stood on the land that her grandmother had cleared. She stood at the sink and looked through the window. The flowers were still there. The mist was still rising from the valley. The wax palm still stood against the sky. The finca was called El Silencio, and it had been called that for a long time. It would be called that for a long time to come. She dried her hands and picked up her hat from the hook beside the door and stepped outside. The air was cool and the mist was rising from the valley. The finca was waking around her, the same waking it had done every morning of her life, and every morning of the 70 years her family had been on this land. The same light arriving over the ridge, and the same sound of the stream, and the same rooster from the neighbor's farm across the valley. The same bird calling from the coffee trees below the house, the first call of the morning, a single note repeated 3 times, and then repeated again. She had heard that call on the first morning of the harvest, and she was hearing it now on the first morning after the flowering. The beginning and the end and the beginning again. She stood on the step and put on her hat and looked at the hillside one more time. The flowers were still there, the mist still rising, the wax palm still standing against the sky. The name on the board above the gate, the faded letters and the weathered wood, the farm unchanged through the generations. She was part of that now, and she would always be part of it. The stream would keep running, and the coffee trees would keep growing, and the flowers would keep appearing after the rain. She would keep walking the rows for as long as she could. The work was the same work her grandmother had done and her mother had done, and it was the work she would do tomorrow and the day after that. The farm would continue. That was the nature of a farm. It outlasted the people who took care of it. But not yet. Not today. Today there was a hillside to walk and coffee to drink, and the mist to watch as it rose from the valley and dissolved into the light of the morning. She stepped off the porch and walked toward the rows. The ground was soft under her boots, and the air was cool against her face as she reached the first bush of the Katura section and bent to look at the new growth. The buds were forming where the flowers had been, the fruit beginning, the beginning of everything that would come. The leaves were soft and new, the color of new green, the color of the season beginning again. She touched a small green bud with her fingertip. It was hard. It would grow. It would become a cherry. The cherry would become red. She would pick it. That was the shape of the year ahead. She straightened up and moved to the next bush. The morning was ahead of her and the season was ahead of her. She was where she was meant to be. The farm asked for her attention and her hands and her patience and her knowledge, and she gave all of these things without thinking about it. The giving was as natural as breathing, as natural as the mist rising from the valley floor at dawn. She was the person who took care of this place, and the place took care of her in return. That was the arrangement that had always existed between the woman and the land on El Silencio. It had always been the arrangement, and it would always be the arrangement. The morning continued around her, the light spreading across the hillside, the mist thinning and rising, the farm waking to another day of the long work that would not be finished in her lifetime. The work would be continued by the next person and the person after that, the way it had been continued by the mother and the grandmother's mother before her. The line would continue or it would not. The work would be done or it would not. Either way, the morning had come, and the mist was rising, and the buds were forming on the branches of the coffee trees. Her hands found the new growth on the next bush, the soft new leaves and the small hard buds that would become the fruit. She worked through the row, bush by bush, her hands knowing the work and the rhythm settling into her body. The morning moved around her as she moved through the rows, the two of them together, the woman and the farm, El Silencio and the woman who took care of it. They were continuing as they had always continued, the cycle turning, the day beginning, the work of El Silencio going on. The finca was called El Silencio, and it had been called that for a long time. It would be called that for a long time to come. The name was painted on a weathered wooden board above the gate, the letters faded by the sun and the rain of many seasons. 3 generations of women had grown coffee on this steep slope of the western range of the Colombian Andes. Valentina was the third. There would be a fourth, or there would not. But for now, there was Valentina, and there was the farm, and there was the morning, and there was the work. The work was enough.